the Pacific Ocean vast, endless, and calm. In 1941, its blue waves carried whispers of conflict. Beneath its serene surface, two powers drifted toward collision: the Empire of Japan and the United States of America. For years, Japan's ambition had grown beyond its shores. It hungered for land, for resources, for dominance over Asia and the Pacific. But standing in its way was a sleeping giant, America, with its fleets anchored across the Pacific Islands. The world was already at war. Europe was burning under Hitler's conquest. But far across the ocean, another storm was gathering, one that would soon turn the Pacific into an inferno. Japan's leaders believed that the only way to secure their empire was through one decisive strike, a blow so powerful that the Americans would lose the will to fight. Their plan: a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In the cold, early hours of December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers cut silently through the Pacific waves. Aboard them waited over 350 planes, bombers, torpedo aircraft, and deadly Zero fighters. The operation was cloaked in secrecy. Every pilot knew the risk. If caught, they could never return home. At 6 o'clock a.m., the first wave launched. Engines roared across the sea as they soared into the morning sky. The sun rose over Oahu, painting the harbor in gold, a beauty soon to be destroyed. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions ripped through the stillness. Battleships like the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma were torn apart in seconds. Black smoke choked the sky as fire consumed the harbor. Men leapt into burning waters. Screams and alarms filled the air. The attack was merciless, precise, and devastating. Within 2 hours, the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet lay crippled, 8 battleships damaged or sunk, hundreds of planes destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans dead. The Japanese pilots turned back, their mission complete. Behind them, Pearl Harbor burned, a graveyard of steel and flame. But in their success, they had awakened something far greater. That same day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The sleeping giant had been struck, and now it would rise. The Pacific would soon echo with the roar of war, across jungles, skies, and seas. The inferno had begun. The news of Pearl Harbor spread across the world like wildfire. America, once divided and uncertain, was now united in fury. From cities to small towns, millions listened to President Roosevelt's words echoing across the radio. No matter how long it may take us, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Overnight, factories turned into weapons forges. Car plants became tank lines. Shipyards worked day and night to rebuild the Navy. Young men, barely out of school, rushed to enlist. Across the Pacific, Japan celebrated its victory, unaware that it had ignited a storm it could never contain. Within weeks, Japan's empire expanded at a terrifying pace. The rising sun flag flew over Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Their troops swept through the Pacific, brutal and unstoppable. They called it the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, but to millions, it meant invasion and terror. In the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers made their desperate stand. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, they fought against overwhelming Japanese forces on the Bataan Peninsula. Supplies ran out, soldiers starved, yet they held on. MacArthur's famous words, "I shall return," became a promise to his men and his nation. But not all could be saved. After months of brutal fighting, Bataan fell. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on the Bataan Death March, a nightmare trek through jungle and heat. Beaten, starved, and killed along the way, over 10,000 would never reach the end. The world began to see the true face of Japan's war, one marked by cruelty and domination. Yet, amid despair, America's resolve hardened. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, now commander of the Pacific Fleet, studied the enemy's every move. The U.S. Navy was wounded, but not broken. Aircraft carriers, once considered secondary weapons, would now become the tip of the spear. America's answer would come not in defense, but in daring. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers took off from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet in a mission that defied logic and distance. The Doolittle raid, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, they struck the heart of Japan, Tokyo. Though the damage was small, the impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese soil burned under American bombs. The message was clear: America was far from defeated. The war in the Pacific was no longer Japan's triumph. It was now a battle of endurance, technology, and willpower. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its eyes were fixed on vengeance. Some 1942, the Pacific had become a battlefield of endless blue. Japan still held the upper hand. Its empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But deep within the American Naval Command, a plan was forming, one that would decide the fate of the Pacific War. The key was intelligence. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked portions of Japan's secret naval code. They learned that Japan's next target was a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific Midway. The attack was meant to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap, but this time it would be Japan walking into the ambush. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, armed with the decrypted intelligence, prepared his fleet in silence. 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, took position northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. On June 4, 1942, the trap was set. At dawn, Japanese aircraft launched their assault on Midway Island, bombing runways and fuel depots. But as they turned to rearm for a second strike, American scout planes found the Japanese carriers. The message went out: enemy sighted. Moments later, the sky erupted. American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown plunged through clouds toward the enemy fleet. The Japanese fighters, caught off guard and out of position, scrambled to defend. From thousands of feet above, the American pilots aimed at the massive decks below. Bombs screamed through the air and hit their marks. In a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and S-Rai, were engulfed in fire. Sailors ran in chaos as explosions tore through the ships. Flames reached the sky, and black smoke rolled across the horizon. Admiral Nagumo, stunned, ordered his last carrier, Hiri, to strike back. Her aircraft hit the Yorktown, crippling her. But the counterattack came too late. American bombers found the Hiri hours later and delivered the final blow. She too went down, burning into the sea. By sunset, the once invincible Japanese carrier force was gone. 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and thousands of men lost in a single day. The Empire's naval strength had been shattered. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was on the defensive. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. As Nimitz reported to Washington, Pearl Harbor has been avenged, but the road to victory was long and bloody. Ahead lay island after island, jungles, beaches, and oceans that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The tide had turned, but the inferno still raged. After the victory at Midway, the Pacific War entered a brutal new phase, one of attrition, blood, and perseverance. The Allies now held the initiative, but Japan was far from broken. The Empire still commanded vast territories, and every island was a fortress waiting to be defended to the last man. The American strategy was simple, yet deadly: island hopping instead of fighting for every patch of sand. The U.S. would capture key islands, one at a time, building airfields and naval bases to push ever closer to Japan. Each victory brought them nearer to Tokyo, but at an enormous cost. The first major test came at Guadalcanal, a name that would become legendary. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on its beaches under the cover of dawn. What they expected to be a swift assault turned into a 6-month nightmare. The jungles were thick, the heat unbearable, and the enemy invisible. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical resolve, launching relentless nighttime attacks, often ending in hand-to-hand combat. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion claimed nearly as many lives as bullets. The air above and the sea below were battlegrounds as well. The Solomon Islands campaign turned the waters red with fire and oil. At night, the horizon burned. The clash of ships and planes echoed endlessly. The Battle of Savo Island, Henderson Field, Iron Batam sound names that mark sacrifice and survival. After months of slaughter, the Japanese finally withdrew. For the first time, their advance had been stopped. Guadalcanal was secured, but victory came at a horrifying price. Over 7,000 Americans and 30,000 Japanese lay dead. From there, the campaign pressed on Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Palaliu. Each island was a miniature hell. Japanese defenders dug deep into caves and tunnels, refusing to surrender. The Americans learned that every yard gained would cost blood. At Tarawa, in 1943, waves of Marines stormed the beaches under relentless machine gun fire. In just 76 hours, the island was captured, but more than 1,000 Marines had been killed. Reporters called it 76 hours of hell. Despite the carnage, the momentum was unstoppable. With each victory, Allied airfields crept closer to the Japanese homeland. B-29 bombers could now reach the cities of Japan, but the closer they came, the fiercer the resistance grew. Japanese soldiers embraced death over surrender. Civilians were caught in the firestorm of invasion. The Pacific had become a graveyard of nations. Still, the American spirit endured. Behind every battle, every casualty, there was a single belief: this war must be won. The islands fell, one by one, and as they did, the road to Japan came into view, a road paved with sacrifice. The Pacific War was not fought only on land or sea. It was also waged high above the clouds. From the coral runways of the islands, thousands of American and Japanese pilots battled for control of the skies. The roar of engines and the scream of dive bombers became the soundtrack of destruction. After Midway, Japan's once mighty air force began to falter. Its veteran pilots, the elite of the rising sun, were dying faster than they could be replaced. America, on the other hand, was training new aviators by the thousands, arming them with faster planes, heavier guns, and a growing confidence born of victory. Across the vast Pacific, aircraft carriers became floating cities of war. From their decks, planes launched daily into deadly duels. Dogfights unfolded over endless oceans, where victory and death were separated by seconds. The American F-6F Hellcat rose to dominance, earning the name Zero Killer for its ability to outfly and outgun Japan's once legendary Mitsubishi Zero. In the skies over Rabaul, Truk, and the Marianas, Hellcats tore through enemy formations, painting the heavens with smoke and fire. The air war was not just about fighters. It was about destruction on a massive scale. The introduction of the B-29 Superfortress changed everything. These colossal bombers could fly higher and farther than any before them, reaching the Japanese homeland itself. From new bases on Saipan and Tinian, waves of B-29s roared toward Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. At first, they targeted military factories, but soon the bombing became total. Entire cities vanished in firestorms that devoured everything in their path. On the night of March 9, 1945, over 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The wooden city turned into a sea of flames. Winds whipped the fire into a hurricane of heat. Tens of thousands died in hours, a tragedy so vast that even hardened soldiers wept at the aftermath. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots turned to a desperate weapon, the kamikaze. Young men, barely 20, climbed into planes loaded with explosives, knowing they would never return. Their mission was simple: crash into American ships and take as many lives as possible. To them, it was the ultimate act of loyalty. To their enemies, it was horror beyond comprehension. The skies over the Pacific became a place of sacrifice, where courage and madness intertwined. Each battle above the clouds brought America closer to victory, but it also revealed the terrible cost of modern warfare. The fire from the sky was unstoppable. The Pacific burned beneath it. By October 1944, the tides of war had turned entirely. The Allies now dominated the skies and seas, and General Douglas MacArthur was ready to fulfill his promise. "I shall return," his destination, the Philippines. Once a proud American territory, now under brutal Japanese control, the operation to liberate it would become the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The plan was immense. Hundreds of ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers formed a steel armada that stretched across the sea. Over 200,000 troops prepared to land on the beaches of Leyte Island. As the first waves hit the shore on October 20th, MacArthur stepped onto Philippine soil, his boots sinking into the surf. "People of the Philippines, I have returned," he declared. His words echoed hope through a nation that had suffered years of occupation. But Japan would not surrender its empire without a final, desperate fight. The Imperial Navy launched a massive counterattack, a three-pronged assault designed to crush the American fleet and destroy the invasion force. From the north, the Japanese sent a Kursk carrier fleet to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful task force away. From the west and south, two enormous battleship groups moved in for the kill. Among them sailed the giant Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, floating fortresses of steel and thunder. The battle raged for days. In the Sibuyan Sea, waves of American aircraft swarmed the Japanese fleet. Bombs and torpedoes rained down like steel rain. The mighty Musashi took 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedoes before she rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. To the north, Admiral Halsey's forces engaged the Kursk fleet, while to the east, a small group of U.S. escort carriers and destroyers, known as Taffy 3, suddenly faced an entire Japanese battleship armada. Outgunned and outnumbered, they fought with unmatched bravery. Destroyers like the USS Johnston and USS Hull charged head-on at the massive enemy ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Pilots launched their planes with whatever they had, sometimes only machine gun ammo to defend their comrades. Against all odds, they turned the tide. The Japanese fleet, thinking they faced a larger force, withdrew in confusion. When the smoke cleared, the Imperial Navy was finished. Its carriers and battleships lay broken beneath the sea. Japan's naval power, once the terror of the Pacific, was gone forever. Leyte Gulf was not just a victory, it was the death blow to Japan's fleet. The way to the Japanese homeland now lay open. But as America advanced, a new, more terrifying chapter awaited the fight for Japan itself. By early 1945, the American advance had reached the doorstep of Japan itself. The next target was a small volcanic island, barely 8 square miles wide. Iwo Jima. To the Japanese, it was sacred soil. To the Americans, it was a strategic prize, a base close enough for bombers to strike Tokyo and for damaged aircraft to land safely on their return. But Iwo Jima would become something else entirely, a symbol of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. The island was a fortress. For months, Japanese General Tadamichi Koribayashi had turned it into an underground city of miles of tunnels, hidden bunkers, and camouflaged gun positions. His 21,000 men were ordered not to die in vain, but to kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost. There would be no retreat, no surrender. On February 19, 1945, the invasion began. From the sea, the horizon flashed with fire, as hundreds of naval guns thundered. The air trembled with the roar of shells and the hum of aircraft. Then came the Marines, tens of thousands of them, wading ashore under a storm of bullets. The beaches were made of soft, black volcanic ash. Every step forward was a struggle. Machine guns tore through the waves. Mortar fire fell like rain. The smell of sulfur filled the air. The island itself seemed alive, breathing fire and smoke. For days, the Americans fought to gain even a few hundred yards. The Japanese defenders, hidden deep within the tunnels, emerged like ghosts to strike, then vanished again underground. It was warfare at its most brutal, fought not for territory, but for survival. On the 5th day, a small group of Marines reached the top of Mount Suribachi, the island's volcanic peak. There, they raised the American flag, a moment captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal, whose image would become one of the most powerful symbols in history. To the men below, The flag meant hope, proof that victory, though distant, was possible. But the battle was far from over. For weeks more, fighting raged across the island's ridges and caves. Grenades, flamethrowers, and hand-to-hand combat became the tools of conquest. Every cave had to be cleared, every tunnel burned out. When it finally ended after 36 days, more than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Nearly every Japanese defender fought to the death. Iwo Jima had been conquered, but at a cost so high that even victory felt hollow. To those who survived, the black sands of Iwo Jima would forever remain sacred, a place where bravery met tragedy, and where freedom was paid for in blood. Spring 1945. The Pacific War had reached its final, most savage chapter. Ahead lay Okinawa, the last major island before Japan itself, a fortress just 350 miles from the homeland. Whoever held Okinawa would control the gateway to Tokyo. For the Allies, victory here would open the door to Japan's surrender. For the Japanese, it would be the last stand, a fight to the death to defend their empire and their emperor. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, more than 1,400 American ships surrounded the island. Battleships fired until their barrels glowed red. The sea itself shook as shells pounded. Japanese positions hidden in the hills and caves. Then came the landing, 180,000 American soldiers and Marines pouring onto the beaches. For the first few hours, it seemed too easy. The beaches were nearly silent, but the quiet was a trap. General Mitsuru Yoshijima, commander of the Japanese forces, had ordered his troops to hold fire until the Americans moved inland. When they did, the island exploded in fury. Machine guns, artillery, and mortars erupted from hidden tunnels. The Americans found themselves trapped in a nightmare of ambushes and mud. The fighting on Okinawa was relentless, the terrain unforgiving, the weather merciless. Torrential rain turned the battlefield into rivers of blood and sludge. Every ridge and cave became a fortress, every hill a graveyard. Among the most brutal battles was the fight for Shuri Castle, the heart of Japanese resistance. U.S. artillery and naval bombardment reduced it to rubble, but still the defenders refused to yield. The Japanese soldiers, driven by desperation and devotion, fought until the very end, often choosing suicide over surrender. From the skies came even greater terror. Thousands of kamikaze pilots, young men prepared to die for their emperor, dove their planes into American ships. Explosions lit the ocean like firestorms. The aircraft carrier Bunker Hill was struck twice, killing hundreds in seconds. Sailors worked frantically to save their ships from flames and chaos. The toll was staggering. By the time Okinawa was declared secured in June 1945, the island was a wasteland. Over 12,000 Americans were dead, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians lay among the ruins. The Japanese military was broken, but their spirit fierce and unyielding, warned the Allies of what awaited on the Japanese mainland. If Okinawa had cost this much, what would an invasion of Japan itself demand? That question haunted every general and every soldier. The war had reached its limit, and the world was about to face a weapon that would change history forever. By August 1945, the war in the Pacific had burned for nearly 4 relentless years. Millions were dead, cities lay in ruins, and Japan still refused to surrender. Every mile of the island nation had been prepared for invasion. Civilians were training with bamboo spears. School children were digging trenches. An American invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, promised to be the bloodiest battle in human history. President Harry S. Truman faced an impossible choice: invade and lose perhaps 1 million lives, or unleash a new weapon, one so terrible that it might end the war in an instant. The weapon was the atomic bomb. Born from the top-secret Manhattan Project, it was a fusion of science and destruction unlike anything the world had ever known. Even many of its creators feared what they had made. At dawn on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, took off from Tinian Island, carrying a bomb named Little Boy. Its target, the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. In an instant, the world changed forever. A blinding flash split the sky, followed by a roaring inferno that consumed everything within miles. The heart of Hiroshima vanished beneath a boiling mushroom cloud. Buildings vaporized, rivers boiled, shadows were seared into stone. More than 70,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the days that followed. 3 days later, Japan still did not surrender, so another mission took flight. On August 9, the B-29 Boxcar carried a second bomb, Fat Man. Its target was the city of Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. Entire districts disappeared in seconds. Another 40,000 lives were lost in the blink of an eye. For days, Japan was silent. The emperor and his generals argued in despair. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire cities erased, the skies still glowing with radiation. Finally, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his nation in a trembling voice. "We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable to bring peace to the world." For the first time in history, Japan surrendered. The guns fell silent. The Pacific, once an inferno, was finally calm. But the calm carried a shadow. The world had entered the atomic age, and mankind had learned a terrible truth: that victory could come at the cost of humanity itself. The fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked both the end of the war and the beginning of a new uncertain world. The bombs had fallen, the cities burned, and silence spread across the Pacific. On August 15, 1945, after years of unimaginable bloodshed, Japan surrendered. The announcement came through a crackling radio, broadcast the voice of Emperor Hirohito, calm, yet filled with sorrow. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. His message was simple and heartbreaking. The war was lost, and peace must be accepted. Across the world, tears, cheers, and disbelief filled the air. In America, church bells rang. Crowds flooded the streets of New York, San Francisco, and London, waving flags and embracing strangers. Victory over Japan Day VJ Day had arrived. For millions, it was the end of fear, the end of waiting, the end of the greatest war the world had ever known. But behind the joy lay devastation. Japan was shattered. Its cities were ashes, its people broken. Over 3 million Japanese had died, and millions more faced starvation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unrecognizable silent wastelands, haunted by survivors known as Hibakusha. The bomb affected people. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender took place aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The scene was solemn and historic. American General Douglas MacArthur, standing tall in his khaki uniform, accepted Japan's unconditional surrender. Before him stood Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, cane in hand, trembling as he signed the document that ended the war. MacArthur's voice echoed across the deck. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored to the world." The ceremony lasted only minutes, but it marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new world order. In the days that followed, American forces occupied Japan, not as conquerors, but as rebuilders. Under MacArthur's leadership, Japan began a transformation from a defeated empire into a democracy. Its war industries were dismantled, its army disbanded, and a new constitution promised peace. But peace came with heavy reflection. The Pacific had seen horrors beyond imagination: Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima. Millions had perished on both sides: soldiers, sailors, civilians. The ocean that once symbolized vast freedom had become a grave for countless souls. And yet, from those ashes rose a powerful truth: that humanity, even after such darkness, could rebuild, forgive, and begin again. The inferno was over, but its echoes would haunt the world forever. When the fires of war finally died, Japan stood in ruins. Its cities were blackened skeletons, its factories silent, its people hungry and broken. The empire that once stretched across Asia was gone, leaving only rubble and regret. But from those ashes, a remarkable transformation was about to begin. The Allied occupation of Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began in September 1945. His mission was unlike any other in history: to rebuild a nation that had been both aggressor and victim, to turn a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy. MacArthur ruled Japan not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. His headquarters in Tokyo became the heart of change. Under his guidance, Japan wrote a new constitution, one that guaranteed freedom, equality, and democracy. The most revolutionary part was Article 9, which renounced war forever. Japan would never again maintain an army for aggression. The emperor, once worshipped as divine, was stripped of political power, but allowed to remain as a symbol of unity. In his first public statement, Emperor Hirohito declared that he was not a god, but a human being, a moment that stunned his people and reshaped Japanese identity forever. Food shortages and homelessness plagued the nation. Millions had lost everything, but slowly, with American aid and Japanese resilience, recovery began. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima started to rise again. Schools reopened. New industries emerged. Women gained the right to vote, and labor unions were legalized. One of the most powerful moments came from Hiroshima itself. Instead of vanishing in bitterness, the city became a global symbol of peace. Survivors, the Hibakusha, told their stories, warning the world never to repeat the horrors of nuclear war. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial and Peace Bell became reminders of both tragedy and hope. Economically, Japan's rebirth was astonishing. Within 2 decades, it transformed from a defeated nation into one of the world's leading industrial powers, the so-called Japanese miracle. Through discipline, innovation, and unity, Japan rebuilt not only its cities, but also its spirit. MacArthur's occupation officially ended in 1952, but his influence lingered. The new Japan emerged as a nation of peace, culture, and technology, a nation determined to prove that even from the deepest inferno, humanity could rise again. The Pacific War had ended in fire. Japan's recovery began in faith in progress, peace, and the enduring strength of its people. The story of Japan after the war was not just about reconstruction, it was about redemption. The Pacific War had ended, but its echoes would never fade. It left behind not only the ashes of nations, but also questions that would haunt humanity forever. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, the war across the Pacific was a story of ambition, courage, cruelty, and consequence. It reshaped the world's map, rewrote history, and revealed both the darkest and most resilient sides of human nature. More than 30 million people perished across Asia and the Pacific. Soldiers, civilians, and innocents caught between empires. Entire cities vanished, cultures were scarred, and generations were lost. Yet out of that suffering came powerful lessons that would shape the modern age. The first was the cost of aggression. Japan's pursuit of domination had led not to glory, but to ruin. Empires built on conquest were destined to fall, crushed by the weight of their own violence. The world had learned that wars born from ambition end only in devastation. The second was the responsibility of power. The atomic bomb, the weapon that ended the war, forced humanity to confront a chilling truth. Science and progress, without morality, could destroy the world. The skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just scenes of victory, they were warnings carved in fire. The third was the value of peace. Out of the horrors of war, Japan and its former enemies forged new alliances. The United Nations was created to prevent such destruction from ever happening again. Though imperfect, it symbolized a shared desire for cooperation over conflict. The soldiers who fought across the islands of the Pacific, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the cliffs of Okinawa, carried with them memories that would never fade. Many never returned. Those who did bore invisible scars. Their bravery and sacrifice became the foundation of peace in the decades that followed. In the years after the war, veterans from both sides sometimes met not as enemies, but as survivors. They shook hands, shared stories, and mourned the friends they had lost. It was a reminder that beyond flags and uniforms, all were human, all had suffered. Today, the Pacific no longer burns with warships or bombs. It is a sea of trade, culture, and connection, proof that peace, though fragile, is possible. The Pacific Inferno was more than a conflict. It was a lesson, one written in fire, sealed in sorrow, and remembered in hope. Because only by remembering the flames can we keep the world from burning again. While history remembers the great battles Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, there were countless other struggles fought in the shadows of the Pacific War. These were the forgotten fronts, where soldiers and civilians alike endured unimaginable hardships. For from the headlines of history, in the dense jungles of Burma, Allied and Japanese forces clashed in brutal conditions. Rain fell endlessly. Disease claimed more lives than bullets. The Chindits, British and Indian special units, led by Ord Wingate, operated deep behind enemy lines, striking swiftly and vanishing into the green wilderness. For the Japanese, supply lines stretched thin, and starvation became as deadly as combat. To the south, the islands of the Philippines became a hellscape of resistance and revenge. When Japan captured the islands in 1942, thousands of Filipino and American troops were forced into the infamous Bataan Death March. 65 miles of agony under the scorching sun. Beatings, executions, and starvation took thousands of lives. Yet, even amid despair, a fierce guerrilla movement rose, waging a secret war until liberation came in 1945. Further north, in China, a different kind of inferno raged. Japanese forces committed atrocities that remain some of the darkest chapters in human history: massacres, medical experiments, and scorched earth campaigns that devastated entire provinces. The Chinese people resisted with courage and sacrifice, enduring suffering that the world would only fully learn of after the war. In New Guinea, Australian and American troops fought some of the most grueling jungle battles of the war. The terrain was unforgiving: steep ridges, thick mud, and swarms of disease-carrying insects. Yet, inch by inch, they pushed the Japanese back, their endurance matching the ferocity of their enemy. And in the vast reaches of the South Pacific, islanders found themselves trapped between giants. Their homes became battlefields, entire villages were destroyed, and many native people served as guides, scouts, and stretcher-bearers, unsung heroes of a global conflict they never asked for. These forgotten battles were not fought for glory, but for survival. They showed the human cost of total war, the silent endurance of those who had no choice but to fight or flee. While history remembers the famous victories, the true story of the Pacific Inferno is incomplete without these voices, the ones drowned out by time, yet echoing still in the jungles, the islands, and the seas. Because every soldier lost, every village burned, and every tear shed became part of the great fire that consumed the Pacific and ultimately the world. Behind the thunder of guns and the roar of engines, another war raged, a war of secrets, fought not with bullets but with codes, deception, and silence. It was a hidden battlefield that would change the course of the Pacific War and shape the future of intelligence forever. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in 1941, it caught America off guard. But what followed was a race to read the enemy's mind. Deep inside underground rooms in Hawaii, Washington, and Australia, cryptographers worked tirelessly to crack Japan's most guarded communication system, the JN-25 Naval Code. After months of painstaking effort, a breakthrough came. American codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, uncovered the meaning of crucial intercepted messages. By early 1942, they knew something big was coming. A Japanese attack planned against a place called AF. Rockefort was convinced that AF was Midway Island. His warning reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who laid a deadly trap. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway unfolded, and thanks to code-breaking, the U.S. Navy ambushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of its carriers. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. The victory didn't just come from courage. It came from information, but the Allies weren't the only ones fighting in the shadows. Japanese spies and radio operators tried to intercept Allied movements as well, and their agents spread across Asia and the Pacific. The war of deception was everywhere. In the jungles of the Philippines and the coasts of Australia, intelligence networks formed. Filipino resistance groups passed coded messages to the Allies, while coastwatchers lone radio operators hidden on remote islands reported Japanese ship movements at great personal risk. Many were captured and executed, their bravery largely forgotten. One of the most secret and crucial parts of this hidden war involved the Navajo code talkers, Native American Marines, who used their language to create an unbreakable code. Japanese cryptographers could not decipher it. These men transmitted vital battlefield communications from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, saving countless lives. Their code was so secure that it remained classified for decades after the war. Every intercepted message, every decoded signal, every whisper in the dark contributed to victory. The war was not only won by soldiers storming beaches, it was won by silent warriors, listening in the shadows, turning knowledge into power. In the Pacific Inferno, the flames of war were fueled not just by bombs and bullets, but by secrets, strategy, and the human mind. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of war still lingered in shattered cities, broken lives, and haunted memories. The Pacific Inferno had ended, yet the world now faced a new challenge: justice. For the countless atrocities committed across Asia and the Pacific, the victors sought to hold the guilty accountable. In Tokyo, a Grand Tribunal was established, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often called the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. From 1946 to 1948, judges from 11 Allied nations gathered to confront the horrors of the war. The accused included generals, ministers, and politicians, men who had once commanded armies and ruled empires. They now sat behind bars, awaiting judgment. Among them was Hideki Tojo, Japan's wartime prime minister, the architect of aggression from Pearl Harbor to Nanking. He faced the court with a stern face and bowed deeply when sentenced to death. In total, 7 Japanese leaders were executed, and many others were imprisoned for life. The trials revealed the darkest truths of the war: the Nanking Massacre, the Bataan Death March, and the medical horrors of Unit 731, where human experiments had been conducted in the name of science. Witnesses spoke through tears. Survivors trembled as they recounted what they had endured. The world listened in disbelief. But justice was not simple. Some argued the trials were victors' justice, while others believed they were the first true step toward international law, a foundation for what would later become the International Criminal Court. Outside the courtrooms, nations began to rebuild. Yet the psychological scars ran deep. For many Japanese, the end of the war brought shame and confusion. For survivors across Asia, in China, Korea, the Philippines, and beyond, the wounds of occupation and loss would take generations to heal. And yet, from this reckoning came remembrance. Peace memorials rose where bombs once fell. Hiroshima became not a symbol of defeat, but of peace, a living reminder of the cost of war and the power of forgiveness. Every year, paper lanterns float down the Motoyasu River, each light carrying a silent prayer: never again. Across the Pacific, veterans and civilians alike carried their memories to their graves. Their stories, once buried, are now told to remind the world what happens when humanity forgets compassion. The Pacific Inferno was not only a war of nations, it was a war for the soul of mankind. Its final lesson still burns: that true victory lies not in conquest, but in remembrance; not in revenge, but in peace. The Pacific War had ended in flames, but from those ashes, a new world was being born. In the ruins of defeat, Japan began a journey unlike any in history, a transformation from empire to ally, from conqueror to one of the world's great democracies. The years following 1945 were uncertain. Cities lay in rubble, families mourned their dead, and the nation's spirit seemed broken. But with determination and guidance, Japan began to rebuild, not through conquest, but through cooperation. Under the watch of General Douglas MacArthur, Japan's reconstruction became a model for peace. Factories once used to forge weapons now produced goods for a growing world economy. Roads, schools, and industries rose from devastation. American aid through the Marshall Plan and new trade opportunities helped Japan stand on its feet. By the 1950s, a miracle was taking shape. Japan's economy surged forward first in textiles, then steel, automobiles, and electronics. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya transformed into bustling centers of innovation and progress. The world began to speak of the Japanese economic miracle, born from discipline, creativity, and a relentless will to rebuild. But Japan's rebirth was not only material, it was spiritual. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reshaped its national identity. Pacifism became its creed. Peace became its greatest export. Under the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan regained its sovereignty and rejoined the international community, not as a threat, but as a partner. Ironically, former enemies became closest allies. The United States and Japan forged a lasting bond, one that endures to this day. American soldiers once at war now stood side by side with Japanese workers rebuilding the same cities they had destroyed. The Pacific, once a sea of death, became a bridge of friendship and commerce. Meanwhile, across Asia, new nations emerged from the shadow of empires. The war had reshaped borders, toppled colonial powers, and given rise to movements for independence. The Pacific Inferno had not just ended an old order, it had ignited a new one. Today, Japan stands as a symbol of resilience, a nation that learned from the darkest chapters of its history to write a brighter one. Its culture, technology, and diplomacy remind the world that peace and progress can rise from even the deepest ruins. The story of the Pacific Inferno does not end with destruction. It ends with rebirth. From the ashes of war rose a testament to humanity's greatest truth, that even after the fiercest fire, hope can bloom again. More than 75 years have passed since the flames of the Pacific War faded, yet its echoes still ripple through time, in politics, in culture, in the fragile balance of peace that holds our world together. The Pacific Inferno was not just a war between nations. It was a turning point for humanity itself. It redefined power, reshaped the global order, and left lessons written in blood and sacrifice. In the aftermath, the United States emerged as a global superpower. Its victory across the Pacific cemented its dominance in Asia and the Pacific Rim, establishing military bases that remain to this day, from Okinawa to Guam, from Hawaii to the Philippines. America's role as a defender of democracy began here, in the ashes of war. For Japan, the war became a mirror, one that forced deep reflection. Today, Japan stands as a beacon of peace and technological brilliance, yet its wartime past remains a source of tension with neighbors who still remember occupation and suffering. The scars of Nanking, Manila, and Seoul have not entirely faded. Reconciliation, though powerful, remains a journey unfinished. Across China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, the memory of Japanese occupation continues to shape politics and identity. Monuments stand where villages once burned. Families still tell stories of loss passed from generation to generation. The ghosts of the Pacific War live on, not to reopen wounds, but to remind the living of the price of forgetting. And the atomic bomb, mankind's deadliest invention, continues to haunt the world's conscience. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of the dangers of absolute power, sparking a global movement for nuclear disarmament. The Cold War that followed the Pacific Inferno only deepened that fear, as nations built weapons capable of ending civilization itself. Yet from destruction also came unity. The United Nations, born from the ruins of World War II, stands as a living promise. However imperfect, that dialogue must always triumph over violence. International law, human rights, and diplomacy became the tools of a new age, forged in the shadow of the inferno. Today, the Pacific Ocean, once a theater of war, has become the heart of the global economy, a bridge between East and West. Ships carry goods, ideas, and hope instead of soldiers. The nations that once faced each other as enemies now meet as partners. But the legacy of the Pacific War endures in every peace treaty signed, every war memorial visited, and every silent moment of remembrance. Because history is not only about what was lost, it's about what humanity chose to learn. And the Pacific still whispers its lesson, that peace is never given, it is earned, every single day. The Pacific War ended long ago, but its story continues to live, carried by the voices of survivors, the ruins left behind, and the historians who refuse to let time erase the truth. These are the guardians of memory, the keepers of a history written in courage, pain, and remembrance. Across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, from Manila to Okinawa, memorials stand as silent witnesses to the past. Each stone, each name, each museum display tells a fragment of a greater story, the story of humanity's darkest hours and its enduring hope. In Hawaii, the sunken hull of the USS Arizona rests beneath clear waters, a tomb for more than 1,000 sailors. Visitors stand in silence above the wreck, watching oil still rise from the depths, a ghostly reminder of the attack that awakened a sleeping giant. In Hiroshima, the Genbaku Dome, left standing amid devastation, has become a world symbol of peace. Each August, lanterns float down the river, carrying prayers from children who were born long after the war, yet still feel its weight. In Australia, the Philippines, China, and the Pacific Islands, war cemeteries and small local museums preserve artifacts, helmets rusted by time, faded letters, and uniforms once worn by those who never came home. These places are sacred, not for their grandeur, but for their honesty. The people who lived through the Pacific Inferno, the veterans, the survivors, the civilians are fewer each year. Their memories, though fragile, are priceless. Many have shared their stories with historians and filmmakers, ensuring that the human truth behind the headlines is never lost. But memory is not just about remembering facts. It is about understanding lessons. Every photograph, every diary, every recorded voice teaches us what happens when hatred, ambition, and fear take control. It reminds us that peace is not built on silence, but on truth. In classrooms, students learn about the war, not to glorify it, but to understand its cost. Documentaries, books, and films bring the Pacific War to new generations, transforming history into empathy, so that the mistakes of the past will never again become the future. The guardians of memory are not just historians. They are every person who chooses to remember, who lights a candle, visits a memorial, or whispers a prayer for those lost to the waves and the fire. Because memory is humanity's greatest defense against destruction, and as long as the world remembers the Pacific Inferno, the flames will never return. Freedom always comes with a price. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, that price was paid in blood, sweat, and tears by millions who fought, endured, and perished in the inferno of war. Their stories, often lost beneath statistics, are the heartbeat of the Pacific Campaign, reminders that behind every victory lay immeasurable sacrifice. On the beaches of Guadalcanal, exhausted Marines clung to muddy foxholes as rain poured endlessly, and jungle diseases ravaged their ranks. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting simply to survive the next hour, the next attack. Many never left the island, their graves marked only by crude wooden crosses swallowed by vines. In Bataan, Filipino and American soldiers held out until their ammunition ran dry and starvation took hold. When they were finally forced to surrender, they faced the brutal Bataan death march. 75,000 men driven through heat and pain, beaten and killed along the way. Their suffering became a symbol of human endurance and defiance against cruelty. At Iwo Jima, every inch of volcanic rock was soaked in blood. The image of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi captured a moment of triumph. But beneath that flag lay thousands who would never see home again. The victory was bought at a cost almost too great to comprehend. More than 26,000 American casualties for just 8 square miles of island. In the skies, bomber crews faced the terror of anti-aircraft fire and the endless ocean below. Many planes disappeared without a trace, their crews' fates unknown. Families back home received telegrams marked simply "missing in action." For them, the war never truly ended. Civilians, too, paid dearly. Japanese families in Okinawa caught between invading armies. Chinese villagers bombed and burned. Pacific Islanders uprooted from their homes. Every one of them carried scars that no metal could ever heal. And yet, amid destruction, there were acts of humanity: a soldier sharing his last ration with a starving child, a nurse refusing to abandon the wounded, enemies showing mercy when they could have chosen vengeance. These small lights pierced the darkness, proving that even in war's cruelest hours, compassion survived. Freedom, in the Pacific, was not handed down. It was carved out through unimaginable courage. It was the echo of boots trudging through jungle mud, the cry of medics calling for stretchers, the silence of letters never delivered. The price of freedom was not measured in miles gained or ships sunk. It was measured in lives. And those lives remind us that liberty is not free, that peace must be guarded as fiercely as it was won. For those who fell in the Pacific Inferno, their sacrifice was not in vain. The world they dreamed of, free, just, and peaceful, is the world we must strive to protect. The guns of the Pacific fell silent in August 1945, but their echoes still shape our world. From the ashes of the Pacific Inferno rose new nations, new alliances, and new understandings of what war and peace truly mean. When the smoke cleared, the Pacific was forever changed. Cities like Tokyo, Manila, and Nagasaki lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Empires that once ruled the waves crumbled into dust. But in their place, something remarkable began: a rebirth. Japan, the former aggressor, rebuilt itself from devastation into a symbol of peace and progress. The words, "never again," became the moral foundation of a new constitution, one that rejected war as a means of settling disputes. Factories that once built tanks now produced cars, radios, and innovations that reshaped the modern world. The United States, now a global superpower, emerged with the burden of leadership, tasked with ensuring that such destruction would never return. The United Nations was born, not from victory, but from tragedy, a collective promise of diplomacy over devastation. Across Asia, nations that had suffered under colonial rule began to demand freedom of their own. The war had ignited a global awakening that the right to self-determination was not reserved for empires, but for all people. The Philippines, Indonesia, India, and others began their march toward independence, inspired by the fire that had burned across the Pacific. The legacy of the Pacific War is not only political, it is deeply human. The stories of survival, forgiveness, and reconciliation reveal that even in the darkest corners of history, hope can endure. Veterans from both sides met decades later, shaking hands where once they had fought. Former enemies became allies, their children playing together under the same sky their fathers once fought beneath. But the Pacific Inferno also left behind haunting questions about the morality of total war, the use of atomic weapons, and the limits of human cruelty. These are questions that still echo through the halls of history and the conscience of mankind. The true lesson of the Pacific War is this: peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. It must be built, tended, and protected not through fear, but through compassion and cooperation. Today, the Pacific stands as a vast ocean of connection, trade, culture, and unity. Beneath its calm waves lie the silent graves of those who paid the ultimate price for that peace. Their memory endures not in monuments alone, but in the choices humanity makes every day. The Pacific Inferno was a tragedy, but also a teacher. It burned away illusions, revealing the truth of what it costs to destroy and what it takes to rebuild. And from that truth emerged a new world, one born not from conquest, but from conscience. When the fires of the Pacific finally died out in 1945, the world hoped that peace had returned for good. But even as nations rebuilt from ruin, new tensions began to rise, invisible, silent, and cold. The Pacific Inferno had ended, but from its ashes emerged a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, once united against fascism, began to fracture almost immediately. Both powers had different dreams for the post-war world. America sought democracy and free markets, while the Soviets spread communism through control and ideology. The Pacific became one of the new front lines in this global rivalry. In Asia, the old colonial powers were gone, leaving behind political vacuums and fragile nations struggling to find their identity. China descended into civil war between the nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, a struggle that would redefine the balance of power in the region. When Mao's forces claimed victory in 1949, the red flag rose over Beijing, signaling a new era. Meanwhile, the United States turned its gaze toward the Pacific once again, not as a battlefield, but as a strategic shield. Islands like Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii became key military outposts, forming a chain of defense against future threats. The U.S. occupation of Japan transformed the once defeated empire into a democratic ally, a pillar of stability amid the growing divide. But peace was fragile. In 1950, the first sparks of the Cold War ignited into open flames on the Korean peninsula. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later by Communist China, invaded the South. The Pacific once again roared with the sounds of artillery, jet fighters, and human suffering. This new war was different, not for conquest, but for ideology. It wasn't about islands or empires, but about the future of the world order. Millions of soldiers, including veterans who had fought in World War II, found themselves back in uniform, facing a new enemy and new uncertainty. The Pacific, once a symbol of victory and sacrifice, was again a chessboard for global power. The same waters that had seen the battles of Midway and Leyte Gulf now carried nuclear submarines and bombers, weapons capable of ending humanity itself. The shadow of the atomic bomb loomed large. Nations raced to build deadlier arsenals, and the people of the Pacific, from Japan to the Marshall Islands, lived under the constant fear of nuclear testing and fallout. The war that had ended all wars had instead given birth to the ultimate weapon. The Pacific Inferno had taught the world the cost of destruction. But as the Cold War deepened, humanity stood at a crossroads once again, between memory and madness, between peace and annihilation. Though the battles of World War II had ended, the Pacific did not find peace. Instead, it became the stage for a new kind of war, one without armies, but far more devastating in its reach. From the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new inferno began to rise, the era of nuclear testing. Between 1946 and 1962, the United States, Britain, and later the Soviet Union turned remote Pacific islands into laboratories of destruction. The world's most beautiful atolls, Bikini, Nuetak, Mururoa, and Christmas Island, became sites of fire and radiation. Their names, once synonymous with paradise, were forever scarred by humanity's thirst for power. In Bikini Atoll, the U.S. conducted its first post-war test operation, Crossroads. Islanders were told they would be relocated for the good of mankind, but they were never truly able to return. Their ancestral lands were poisoned, their homes vaporized in blinding flashes of white light. The explosions were beyond comprehension, mushroom clouds towering miles high, shockwaves rippling across the ocean. The power unleashed in a single blast dwarfed the bombs that had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientists called it progress. The islanders called it tragedy. The Castle Bravo test in 1954 changed everything. What was supposed to be a controlled hydrogen bomb experiment became a catastrophic miscalculation. The blast was far stronger than predicted, more than 1,000 times the force of Hiroshima. Fallout reigned over neighboring islands and far beyond, contaminating land, sea, and life. Japanese fishermen aboard the Daigo Fukuri Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, were caught in the radioactive cloud. They returned home sick, one of them dying weeks later. For Japan, it reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The people of the Pacific, the Marshallese, the Polynesians, The Micronesians became unwitting victims of the new arms race. Generations suffered from radiation sickness, cancer, and genetic damage. The islands once filled with song and coconut palms became ghostly test zones, marked by craters and silence. Yet, amid despair, voices rose. Islanders began to speak out demanding justice, recognition, and remembrance. Their struggle brought the world's attention to the hidden cost of nuclear power. In time, the global movement for disarmament was born, driven by those who had seen the fire firsthand. The Pacific, once burned by war, was now scorched by science. And yet, from those ashes, a new understanding emerged that humanity could not survive another inferno. The nuclear age had begun, but so, too, had the age of awareness. The echoes of those tests still resonate across the ocean, in the soil, in the water, and in the memories of those who witnessed the sky burn twice.